Hey, so over here today, this is the third and final video of my take on camera basics. If you haven't seen the first two, I highly suggest you check those ones out. I'll have the links in the descriptions down below. Basically, the first one was on shutter speed, second one was on ISO, and now today it's all about aperture. Now basically, aperture is the opening within a lens. So every single lens has blades. It depends on the lens that you're using that will decide or determine how many blades are in there, but every single lens has blades on the inside of them. These blades can be adjusted to make the opening within a lens wider or narrower. Before we move on, we need to know how to reference how wide or how narrow this opening is though. And that's what brings us to f-stop, or the f-stop number. F-stop is the number depicting how wide or how narrow this opening is. The lower the number is, the wider this opening is, and the higher the number is, the more narrow this opening is. So for example, a lens that can open as close to 0 as possible, which means it's open really wide, is a fast lens because it lets in more light. On the opposite side of the spectrum, a lens that's far away from 0 is a slow lens because it doesn't let in a lot of light, because a lens that has a number that's further away from 0 means it's more narrow, it's tinier opening. This number also doesn't always have to be represented by an f-stop number or an F. You can also see it as a ratio, meaning there's going to be a 1 and a colon and then another number following that as well. That number that follows the 1 and the colon is the widest the aperture can open to. So based off of that number, we already know if a lens is fast or not, because if there's a 1 colon and a 3.5 or higher, then we know it's pretty slow. It's not that great at low light because it doesn't let in a lot of light. But if we have a lens that's a 1, a colon, and a 1.4, then we know that's really close to 0. So that means that opens up really wide, which lets in a lot of light, which means it's a fast lens. So as we know, shutter speed is how long the sensor is going to be exposed to the light, the surrounding light, or the image that we're trying to capture. And ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor to the surrounding light or the image that we're trying to capture. Now aperture is how much light or how much of the image is actually getting let in within that moment. So once again, if you have a low f-stop number, that means you have a wide opening, which is going to let in a lot of light as soon as you click the shutter down. A lens that's wide open, that lets in a lot of light, that's 1.8 or lower to 0, means it's a fast lens. It lets in a lot of light, which means it's a good lens for low light. A lens on the opposite side that has a higher number, 3.5 or higher, means it's pretty slow. It doesn't let in a lot of light when you need it during darker times. Aperture doesn't just affect the amount of light coming in or not coming in, it also affects our depth of field. Now without adding too much information to confuse the heck out of you guys, depth of field is basically just the space within your image or video that's going to be in focus. So for example, if you guys are looking at me, I'm in focus right now. But if I put my hand next to the lens, my hand is not in focus and behind me is not in focus. That's because my hand nor the back of me is in that depth of field. Only my face is within depth of field. So I can hold my hand up and it's in focus right now, but the closer I bring it to the lens, it starts falling out of that depth of field plane. Or if I were to put it behind me more, you'll slowly see it go out of focus as well. So that's, aperture affects that as well. Basically what happens is the lower you are to 0, or the closer you are to 0, the more wide the lens opens to. And the wider you open to, the smaller that spacing of what can be in focus gets. Then if you go completely opposite, you make the opening narrow in your lens, then that means that depth of field or the space of what's in focus gets a lot bigger. So it's confusing as heck because it's completely opposite of the lens, but those are intertwined together. The wider it is, the more narrow your depth of field is, or the smaller amount of what's in focus in your images. The more narrow your lens opening is, the more you can have in focus. So just keep that in mind. Confusing as heck, but you'll learn to deal with it. So to wrap this all up, aperture is basically just the opening in your lens. We use f-stop numbers or the ratio to depict how wide or how narrow this opening is. And basically a lens that can open really wide, let's say 1.2 to 1.8, is a fast lens because it opens wide and lets in a lot of light, which makes it easier to use in low light situations. But keep in mind, aperture doesn't only affect the amount of light coming in, it also affects our depth of field. And our depth of field is just the space of what's in focus within our image or our video clip. Now the easiest way to remember this, the smaller the number, the smaller your depth of field. The the bigger the number is, the bigger your depth of field is. So don't compare your depth of field to the opening, but compare it to the number strictly. So if you have a lens that's opened up to 1.2, that's a small number. That's really, really small. So that means your depth of field is gonna be super, super small as well. But if you close down or narrow down the opening in your lens to say an f11, that's a bigger number, so your depth of field is gonna be bigger. Keep that in mind, and that'll make it easier to remember and understand depth of field and your aperture opening as well. So I hope that didn't confuse the heck out of you. I might add in one more video just to kind of compile everything all together of examples and stuff. But with that being said, that is my rendition of camera basics. I hope it didn't confuse the heck out of you guys with all 3 videos. But if it did, hit me up in the comments below and I'll gladly redo these videos or put something together differently, or just go ahead and answer your questions in the comments below. But until next time, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace.